welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
Today, we are venturing into the fascinating and, let's be honest, often challenging but ultimately incredibly rewarding philosophy of Gilles Deleuze.
Definitely challenging, yeah, but worth it.
If you've ever encountered his name, you probably know he's associated with ideas that can seem quite abstract at first glance. Concepts like, difference, repetition, becoming, and machines. It can feel a bit like stepping into a whole new intellectual landscape with its own language.
It certainly requires a shift in perspective. Deleuze's work fundamentally challenges so many of the assumptions we carry about identity, about what a subject even is, and about, well, the very nature of reality and how we think about it. He's really asking us to look at the world differently.
And that's precisely our mission with this deep dive. We've gathered a stack of source material, excerpts from critical studies, some illuminating interviews with Deleuze himself, and analyses that connect his thought to other major figures who influenced him or, with whom he engaged. Thinkers like Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, Foucault, and of course his longtime collaborator, Félix Guattari.
Quite a lineup.
It is. Our goal is to navigate this material with you, to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and to explain Deleuze's key ideas, themes, and terminology in a way that feels accessible, insightful, and maybe even sparks some aha moments for you. Think of this as, a shortcut perhaps, to grappling with some truly powerful and maybe surprising concepts that can genuinely shift how you understand the world.
We want to help you see the underlying terrain of his thought, right? To find those surprising connections and radical implications that make exploring this stuff so worthwhile. It's about making sense of ideas that, at their core, aim to liberate thinking itself.
Liberate thinking. That sounds pretty significant. Okay, let's unpack this. Where does Deleuze come from philosophically, and why does he feel the need to challenge the way we usually think? What's his starting point?
Well, Deleuze emerges from and responds to the major intellectual currents of the 20th century. He's engaging directly with things like structuralism, the search for deep, often unseen, organizational structures beneath phenomena and psychoanalysis, which obviously reshaped understandings of the mind and desire. But a particularly important thread he picks up and then radically transforms is phenomenology.
Right, phenomenology. The philosophical tradition we associate with thinkers like Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger focused on the study of conscious experience, how things appear to us.
Exactly, and they had a crucial insight that Deleuze definitely builds upon. They critiqued the traditional assumption that we understand ourselves and the world through predetermined concepts or from the viewpoint of a fixed pre-existing subject, like that old idea of the human being as primarily a rational animal with a stable identity.
That classical view.
Yeah. Instead, Husserl, and especially Heidegger, urged philosophers to look directly at life in its dynamic flow, at phenomena appearances as they manifest and become through time, not filtering them through established categories or assuming a fixed I who experiences them. It was a call to pay attention to appearances in their immediacy and process.
So they were saying, instead of starting with, okay, I am a rational human and therefore I experience the world like this, they were asking us to look at the raw experience, how it unfolds first.
Precisely. They shifted the focus to the appearing itself. Now, Deleuze takes this emphasis on appearance and dynamic flow and pushes it much, much further with his concept of the simulacra.
Simulacra. Okay, I think you mentioned the intro traditionally. That often means like a copy without a real original, like a fake Rolex that looks like the real thing but lacks the authentic source.
Yes, that's one historical meaning, often tied back to Plato's hierarchy, where an image is seen as a degraded copy of a true form. But for Deleuze, this hierarchy is completely inverted, or maybe just abolished. Simulacra are appearances, but crucially, they are appearances in themselves. There is no original, no foundation, no underlying true reality behind them that they are copies of.
Okay, hold on. So the appearance isn't of something else. It doesn't represent a deeper reality.
Right. The world, in Deleuze's view, drawing from some of these sources, isn't a collection of stable things that have appearances. The world is a swarm or constellation of appearances. There's no underlying ground, no foundational experiencing mind or stable subjects standing outside the appearances and perceiving them. The appearances aren't happening to a subject. They are the reality. They are self-sufficient expressions.
Wow. So there's no deeper, more real layer beneath the surface, just surface upon surface, swarming appearances.
That's the radical move. And yeah, it can be challenging. It dissolves the traditional distinction between appearance and reality in a really fundamental way. And Deleuze doesn't limit this idea just to human perception either. He suggests that all life, even non-conscious processes, expresses itself through images, through appearances, and participates in these simulation events.
Even simple things. You
Totally.
mentioned photosynthesis earlier.
Yeah, think about a plant cell interacting with light. Traditionally, we might describe the light as an object out there being perceived by the cell, but in a Deleuzian sense, the interaction is a dynamic interplay of appearances. The light wave is an appearance, the cellular structure is an appearance, and their interaction is a simulation event, a process of expression through images. You don't need to posit an underlying, more real entity or a conscious subject doing the perceiving.
So it's an interaction of phenomena.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He even sees this in technical processes, cameras, for instance. They don't perceive in the human sense, obviously, but they create images. They participate in the expression of appearances in simulation events.
That really broadens the scope of what we mean by image or appearance. And this is where cinema becomes so important for him then.
Absolutely crucial. Deleuze saw the historical development of cinema, particularly modern and avant-garde cinema, as a powerful philosophical event precisely because it could potentially free images from the constraints of the human eye, from a fixed perspective, and from traditional narrative demands. Cinema has a power to see, or maybe better, to present images beyond typical human perception. It allows us to encounter these simulacra in their raw, untethered state. It can show us imaging itself.
You can bypass our usual filters and show us the swarm of appearances more directly, in a sense.
That's the potential he sees in it, yeah. Okay, so if the world is this dynamic swarm of simulacra without a fixed ground or pre-existing subject, how does this fundamental view impact the way we think? You mentioned his critique of the image of thought. Yes. Deleuze argues that traditionally our thinking relies on what he calls a pre-philosophical image of thought. This image, sort of unconsciously, assumes that identity comes first. We start by positing stable entities A is A, and then we understand difference as something secondary, something that happens between existing identities, A is different from B, or as a variation within an identity, A changes, so it's different from its previous state. Difference is always subordinate to an underlying sameness or identity.
So we categorize, we identify, and then we look at the differences. That sounds like how we normally operate.
It does, doesn't it? His major project, especially in difference and repetition, is to find a way to think about difference that doesn't subordinate it to identity. To develop an ontology of difference, a philosophy of being where difference is primary and self-sufficient, not derived or secondary. Difference itself is expression, production, the fundamental process.
An ontology of difference, the idea that being is difference, not identity. That feels like, well, like trying to stand on shifting sand, philosophically speaking.
It is a radical departure, absolutely. And it requires a different understanding of philosophical activity itself. For Deleuze, philosophy isn't primarily about representing a pre-existing world or describing fixed truths. Philosophy, like art and science, is fundamentally a creative activity. Philosophy creates concepts. Art creates effects and percepts. Science creates functions. And crucially, these are impersonal creations.
Impersonal. How can thinking be impersonal? Isn't it something I do, I think, therefore I am, kind of thing?
Well, this is key. A concept, in the strong Deleuzian sense, isn't just what I think as a particular individual. It's not an expression of my personal opinion, my unique viewpoint, or the contents of my individual consciousness. Creating a concept is an attempt to generate thought, to create new ways of thinking, beyond the limitations of any pre-given I or subject. It's an impersonal act of creation, tapping into forces of thought that exceed personal boundaries.
So it's not my thought, but a thought happening.
Kind of, yeah. This impersonal nature is absolutely vital for truly creative thought in any domain, philosophy, art, science. It's about thinking through these forces and becomings, not just thinking from a supposedly fixed individual self.
So it's less about my subjective thoughts and more about tapping into a broader, impersonal potential for thought itself, a power of thought operating beyond me.
That's the idea. It's a power of thought that operates on a plane beyond individual subjects, a plane philosophy tries to access and articulate.
All right, let's dive deeper into those core concepts you mentioned earlier. Difference, repetition, and becoming. We've touched on the ontology of difference. The difference is primary. How does this relate to his idea of repetition? Because, I mean, repetition usually means doing the same thing again.
Right, and this is the fascinating paradox at the heart of his work, particularly difference and repetition. For Deleuze, true repetition is not simply repeating the same thing identically. That's what he calls naked repetition, or maybe just habit. He's interested in a different kind of repetition, a transcendental repetition, which is actually a force of difference.
Repetition as a force of difference. Okay, my brain is trying to nod itself a little bit here. How does that work?
It seems counterintuitive, definitely, because we're so used to thinking of repetition as establishing sameness. But transcendental repetition doesn't repeat the thing itself, the observable phenomenon, or the known text. It repeats the hidden forces, the underlying dynamics of difference that produce that thing or text in the first place. It's a repetition of the process of creation, not just the finished product. It sort of reiterates the conditions under which something is produced differently each time.
Okay, so it's repeating the how or the why of something coming into being, the potential, which then manifests as something new or different each time.
Exactly. It repeats the potential, the virtual forces that lead to actualization. And this is where Henri Bergson's influence becomes absolutely central, especially his concept of duration.
Bergson's duration, wasn't that about time not being just a series of discrete points like beads on a string, but more like a continuous flow, melody?
Yes, but Deleuze draws on Bergson's deeper insight there. Duration isn't just a linear flow, it's understood as virtual coexistence. The past doesn't simply disappear into nothingness. It coexists virtually with the present. And even potential futures coexist in this duration. All these different moments or layers of time are present together virtually in potential.
Like layers of geological time all existing right now under our feet, but virtually.
That's a decent analogy. And Bergson argued that our analytical conceptual thought tends to chop this duration up into discrete points for easier handling. But intuition, a different mode of knowing, allows us to grasp this virtual coexistence. Intuition lets us perceive objects, or different degrees of reality or intensity, as coexisting in a way that transcends simple oppositions, like idealism versus realism or mind versus matter. They exist together virtually.
So intuition is key to perceiving this virtual reality where different degrees coexist.
Yes. These coexistent degrees are what make duration virtual. It holds all the potentiality. And this virtual realm is actualized or differentiated into the specific reality we perceive. Bergson's famous example is intelligence and instinct. He argued they aren't just opposites, there are different degrees of relaxation or contraction within the virtual potential of life or consciousness. They coexist virtually, and any given action might actualize a different mix or degree of each.
So everything that could be, in different forms or intensities, coexists virtually, and our reality is just one specific actualization of that potential, a specific tuning.
That's the Bergsonian idea Deleuze adapts. And here's a crucial distinction Deleuze takes from Bergson. The virtual is not the same as the possible. The possible is like a pre-existing mold or blueprint. Actualization is just making a copy. It's predetermined, really. But the virtual is actualized through invention. It's a genuine creation. Something truly new comes into being, not just a realization of something that was already possible in a latent form.
Invention implies unpredictability and genuine novelty, not just filling in the blanks.
Precisely. And how does the virtual actualize or differentiate? Bergson describes differentiation as happening when these coexistent degrees are forced into opposition. The duration, instead of just flowing linearly, splits into two symmetrical streams or tendencies. The difference between the past and the present, for example, isn't just a difference in their position in time, it's a difference in nature, because they are inverse degrees that result from this dynamic differentiation process. One stream is memory, the other is perception and action, diverging from the virtual.
Okay, duration as virtual coexistence actualized through invention and differentiation. That's a lot to hold on to.
Yeah.
How does this transcendental repetition and the Bergsonian view of duration relate back to something more concrete, like literature?
Well, Deleuze and Guattari use this framework to distinguish between major and minor literature. Minor literature, they argue, operates precisely through this concept of transcendental repetition. It doesn't seek to express a fixed, authentic, individual voice appealing to a known tradition. Instead, it repeats and transforms existing texts, particularly those of the dominant culture or tradition.
Like post-colonial writers engaging with the literature of the colonizers, taking Shakespeare and turning it on its head.
Exactly. That's the kind of example the sources point to. Think of how writers from marginalized positions take classic texts and rewrite them from a different perspective. This isn't just copying or parody, though. It's a repetition of the source material that reveals the underlying forces, the implicit assumptions, and crucially, the specific style of the original voice. It shows the past traditions say the voice of England, not as a fixed authoritative law, but as just one force among others, a potentiality that can be actualized and transformed to create a new future.
And they emphasize that style isn't just decorative. It's not just the fancy wrapping paper on the meaning.
Not at all. For Deleuze, style is intrinsic to the voice, the meaning, the what of a text. There's no underlying message or fixed content separable from the literary effect and becoming that the style embodies. The style is the becoming of the text, the way it unfolds its difference.
That gives style immense philosophical weight. Okay, now let's tackle becoming. You've used the term already, but how is it a distinct core concept for him?
Becoming, for Deleuze, is really the fundamental process itself. It's the pure difference, the tendencies to differ, the flows and forces that underlie reality before they get pinned down. Think of the pure differential waves of sound or light before they are actualized by a sensory organ. These are pure becomings, pure tendencies to differ.
And the world we perceive with stable objects and qualities, like this table, this microphone.
That actual world, the world of identifiable beings with their qualities, is seen as a contraction or actualization of these underlying virtual flows of becoming. Perception itself is an act of actualization. My eye actualizes certain light waves as color, but there are many other ways those same light waves exist and can be actualized. A plant actualizes them for photosynthesis. A physicist actualizes them as frequencies. The key is there's always more to the virtual plane of becoming than is ever actualized in any given perception or form.
So the virtual is always overflowing the actual.
Exactly. The world of beings is made of these temporary contractions, these actualized forms of becoming flows.
So what we see as solid, stable reality is really just a temporary freezing or contraction of a more fundamental process of flux and difference.
That's the perspective shift he's pushing for. And this leads to concepts like becoming imperceptible. This doesn't mean literally disappearing or becoming invisible. It's presented more as an ethical mode of perception and existence. It means learning to experience the forces of life, the dynamic becomings that compose us and the world, rather than immediately reducing everything to fixed objects, stable identities, or judging it through preset moral systems like good and evil.
It sounds like trying to tune into the underlying vibrations or forces, the connections, rather than just looking at the surface things they create and labeling them.
Exactly. The sources use the example of Bret Easton Ellis's novel American Psycho. The character of Patrick Bateman, his extreme violence and self-absorption. Well, the idea isn't just to portray him as inherently personally evil. The novel can be read as a symptomatology, diagnosing how impersonal forces like an intense investment in the image of the hardened American individual, certain cultural images, financial flows, and self-promotion manifest through this character. Reading the novel becomes an exercise in perceiving these impersonal forces and engaging with the becoming imperceptible of the character, seeing him as an effect of forces rather than simply judging him as a moral agent who is evil.
So becoming imperceptible is about seeing the forces behind the individual.
Yeah, opening ourselves to experience these composing forces without automatically imposing moral or identity judgments. It's a process, not a destination.
That's a profound reframing, shifting the focus from the individual's fixed traits to the impersonal forces shaping them. And it's a becoming, a process, not a state you arrive at.
Yes, it's not a state you arrive at. It's an ongoing practice of perception and potentially freedom.
You also mentioned becoming animal earlier. That one certainly catches the ear. Sounds a bit shamanistic.
Huh. Well, maybe. It's another crucial form of becoming other. And again, it's not about literally transforming into an animal or imitating one. It's described as a hybrid, transversal process. It cuts across the human and the animal, creating something new that isn't reducible to either. It's a process of connection and transformation that bypasses fixed identities.
Process of transformation through connection to something non-human. So not being an animal, but connecting with an animal force.
Sort of. The example from the sources is the relationship between Captain Ahab and the whale in Moby Dick. Ahab's obsessive pursuit in a Deleuzian reading isn't primarily about conquest or control or even revenge in a simple sense. It's about a radical process of self-transformation initiated by perceiving difference. The whale isn't just an object or a symbol. It's a singular event of life, a dynamic power of becoming, this massive force of nature. The novel isn't read as Ahab becoming a whale or vice versa, but about a transversal becoming, the intense dynamic interaction and connection between Ahab's perceiving fascination and the whale's mobile, powerful body.
So it's the line between them.
Exactly. This connection produces events and transformations unintended by either one alone. It's the line of connection, the process between them, that constitutes the becoming. Not merging, but interacting across a difference.
So it's the dynamic relationship, the line between entities that creates the transformation.
Precisely. It's the becoming between them. Another critical becoming is becoming woman, often discussed in the context of sexuality. For Deleuze and Guattari, desire isn't rooted in human subjects or specific objects. It's understood as a fundamental, pre-personal, pre-human flow of life, a primary energy or force of becoming. Human beings, with our usual sense of ourselves as stable subjects with fixed identities, tend to repress this flow.
And why repress it? Is it just because society forbids certain expressions of desire, like Freud might say?
They argue the repression goes deeper than social prohibition or psychological lack, like in the Oedipal complex's focus on denied objects, the mother's body, etc. They see it as repression caused by the excess of life itself, the sheer creative force of becoming that exceeds and disrupts personal boundaries and intentions. The intense, chaotic, productive forces of life are always more than the limited, stable image of the self we try to maintain. We repress this excess, this potential for radical disruption and creation that violates our sense of a fixed personal boundary.
So sexuality and desire aren't something that start with us as individuals. We don't own our desire.
That's the key Deleuzian move, yeah. We tend to think of sexuality as something we do, as human subjects interacting with others. But for Deleuze, human bodies are seen more as effects of a sexual becoming, vehicles or points of actualization for these impersonal flows of desire. Desire produces and exceeds bodies. It's a free-flow, creative difference. And becoming, that doesn't originate from bodies or seek a predetermined end, like a selfish gene might suggest.
Wow, that really turns conventional thinking about desire on its head. Okay, so life is a flow of becoming actualized temporarily as the things and identities we perceive, and we can engage with this flux through processes like becoming imperceptible, becoming animal, and understanding sexuality as a pre-personal flow. This feels like a constant state of transformation, or at least potential transformation.
It absolutely is. And this leads seamlessly into their concept of machines.
Machines. Okay, now are we talking about gears and circuits, or is this another metaphorical use?
Not just metaphorical, though not limited to physical machines either. In works like Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari propose that life is literally machinic, and this concept is central to their ethics and politics.
Literally machinic. How is their idea of a machine different from, say, a conventional machine or a biological organism?
They make a sharp distinction. An organism is typically viewed as a bounded, closed whole with a fixed identity and a predetermined function or purpose, like a heart pumping blood. A mechanism is maybe a more closed technical machine with a specific function. A machine, in their sense, is defined not by what it is in isolation, but by its connections and its processes. It's not made by or for anything specific. It's a constant process of deterritorialization, of becoming other than itself by connecting with other things.
So the connections are primary, not the inherent identity of the parts. The machine is its connections.
Exactly. The identity emerges from the connections, and it's always in flux, always becoming something else through new connections. Take the bicycle example they use. By itself, it's just metal and rubber. It has no inherent end or intention. It only functions as a bicycle in the relevant sense when it connects with another machine, the human body. This connection forms a new assemblage, a new machine, the cyclist vehicle machine. And connecting the bicycle to different things creates different machines connecting it to a gallery space, and an artist makes it part of an art-producing machine.
That's a powerful way to think about identity not as inherent, but as a product of connection and assemblage, relational identity.
Yes, and they argue that no aspect of life, from the cellular level to complex social formations, is not machinic in this sense. All life works and is only insofar as it connects with other machines, forming larger assemblages. Our conventional image of closed, self-contained entities, the human organism, a company, a nation-state, are seen as effects or illusions of this underlying machinic reality, temporary stabilizations of flows and connections.
So everything is part of a vast network of connecting and interacting machines, constantly plugging into each other.
That's the core idea of the universe as a machinic assemblage, and this brings us directly to desiring machines. For Deleuze and Guattari, the unconscious mind isn't structured around the Freudian family romance, focused on mythical conflicts or lack, like castration anxiety or Oedipus. It's a desiring machine directly connected to and investing in the entire social field, economic, political, cultural, technological.
So desire isn't about something I lack or something I want to possess personally.
No. Desire in this framework is fundamentally about production and connection. It's not about lack. The libido, the desiring energy, doesn't just invest in people or objects. It invests in flows of money, flows of information, flows of materials, flows of energy within the social field. This investment creates connections, but also cuts, stoppages, leaks, and syntheses within those flows. There's a latent desire that is coextensive with society itself, a force producing singularities and ruptures within the social fabric.
And this is where their critique of psychoanalysis becomes really sharp, isn't it?
Precisely. They argue that traditional psychoanalysis tends to capture and crush these socio-political contents of the unconscious. It reduces the vast, creative, and potentially disruptive power of desiring machines to a limited, mythical, familial grid, the mommy-daddy triangle. They see psychoanalysis as focusing on reducing the perceived excess of desire. Oh, you have too many desires, that's the problem. And promoting social adaptation, rather than understanding, producing, and potentially unleashing desire to bring singular social constellations and new forms of life into being.
So psychoanalysis domesticates desire. It channels it back into the family drama instead of letting it loose on the world.
That's exactly their point. Guattari especially saw psychoanalysis as an interpretation machine that splits the subject and inhibits the production of new statements and desires by constantly recentering everything on this limited domestic drama, blocking its connection to the wider social field.
It sounds like they see it as domesticating or socializing desire, rather than exploring its full, potentially revolutionary potential.
That's a good way to put it. Now, alongside these productive desiring machines, they introduce the paradoxical concept of the body without organs, or BWO.
Body without organs.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds abstract and maybe a bit unsettling. Is it literally a body with no organs?
No, not literally a body without physical organs. It's a key concept, always present, primordial, but in contrast to the productive machines, it's described as unproductive or even anti-production. It's the plane upon which the machines operate.
Unproductive. How so?
The desiring machines connect and produce, and in doing so, they assemble bodies, organizing them into organs or configurations, functions. The experience of this process, of the machines intensely connecting and producing, can feel overwhelming, chaotic, fragmented, the feeling of a body being traversed by forces, sometimes seemingly without its coherent, organized structure. They reference Francis Bacon's paintings with their distorted, intense figures where organs seem detached or the body lacks stable form as a kind of visual representation of this intense, sometimes unbearable experience of the body as a field of forces rather than a fixed organism.
So the BWO is like the potential raw material or the field upon which the machines operate, and sometimes that operation feels chaotic or violent.
Yes, it's the substratum of intensity, potentiality, and also resistance to organization. But the BWO also has poles, different ways it can be actualized or experienced. One pole is a dangerous, even catatonic state, a sort of black hole of undifferentiation, a refusal of organization altogether. But another pole is described as a revolutionary pole. This pole assembles desiring machines at the periphery, pushing outwards, creating lines of flight. This pole asserts, I'm not your kind, and has the potential to sweep away established social conventions, fixed identities, or cause existing systems, social, psychological, political, to break down.
This sounds like the force driving radical change or resistance, the energy that breaks molds.
It is. They use a wall metaphor here, which I find very helpful for understanding this. Imagine you encounter a limit, a social wall, a psychological wall, a political wall. You hit it. One path, the revolutionary path associated with this pole of the BWO, is to break through that wall, to initiate a revolution, maybe start living fundamentally differently outside the established system. Staying stuck right at the wall, unable to break through or pull back, is uncomfortable. You might get spewed out, marginalized, stuck in a kind of painful limbo. The other option is to pull back from the wall and continue to function, perhaps uncomfortably, within the existing system. The revolutionary pole of the BW is the impulse and the force to breach that wall.
That wall metaphor really crystallizes the concept and the choices involved. It makes a very abstract idea feel quite tangible, actually. The feeling of hitting a limit and deciding whether to retreat, stay stuck, or push through.
Exactly. It grounds the concept in a felt experience of limits and possibilities.
Okay, let's loop back to thinking for a moment. You've emphasized that for Deleuze, thought is a creative, impersonal act, seeking to move beyond the individual subject. How does this connect to his concept of the outside? You mentioned it earlier.
This distinction is crucial, particularly in his book on Foucault. Deleuze distinguishes between the exterior and the outside.
What's the difference between exterior and outside? They sound pretty similar in everyday language.
They do, but philosophically they're quite different here. Conventionally, we think of the exterior as the world outside our interior mind or subject. Our thinking often operates by creating planes of transcendence. These planes establish divisions. They distinguish the interior, the mind, the knowing subject, from the exterior, the world we perceive, know, and represent. We project ideas or structures onto reality. But Deleuze argues that this interior-exterior division and the transcendent planes that create it rely on something hidden, something presupposed, something that remains radically outside this created division.
So the outside isn't just the world external to my mind. It's something else entirely, more fundamental.
Yes, the outside is more fundamental. It's the plane of immanence itself, the underlying field of forces, flows, assumptions, distinctions, and distributions from which our thought and our perceived world with its interior-exterior division are produced. It's the unthought ground, the milieu of pure difference and process, from which the very possibility of an interior subject and an exterior object emerges.
Like the fabric before it's folded.
That's a great analogy he uses. Think of it like folding a piece of paper. The fold creates an inside and an outside relative to the fold. But the paper itself, the material of the fold, exists outside the distinction created by the fold. Similarly, the subject's interiority and the world's exteriority are seen as products or foldings of this radical outside, this impersonal plane of experience or perception.
So the outside is the presupposed impersonal ground or milieu of being and thought before it gets organized into subjects and objects.
Exactly. It's the field of forces and pure experience prior to being structured by transcendent ideas or subject-object divisions. And Deleuze doesn't dismiss the creation of transcendent planes, like truth, God, being, entirely. He acknowledges that they show us as inventive animals, capable of incredible acts of creation and organization. But he also reminds us they are constructed, they fold reality in a particular way, and they rely on something that remains outside them.
This connects back to his earlier work on empiricism, doesn't it? With Hume.
Absolutely. Drawing on Hume, for instance. For empiricists like Hume, and Deleuze reads him this way, experience doesn't happen to a preformed subject who then processes it. Experience takes place in the mind, yes, but the mind functions more like a site where connections of impressions and ideas happen. Ideas are formed from experience and the connections made within the mind site. The subject isn't seen as the author of ideas or perceptions, but rather as an effect of these experiences and connections occurring at this site. The mind is the space where connections of impressions take place, rather than a self-aware subject who deliberately does the connecting.
The mind is a site and event space, rather than a central command post.
Okay. And where does structuralism, which you mentioned right at the start, fit into this landscape? He engaged with that too.
Right. Structuralism, in the sense Deleuze discusses it, particularly French structuralism, is important because it emphasized a third order, the symbolic, which they argued was irreducible to the real, the actual physical stuff, or the imaginary, our mental images or fantasies. This symbolic order operates based on atomic elements, like linguistic units or cultural signs, and a combinatory formula, a set of rules for their arrangement. It doesn't rely on sensible forms or fixed essences. For some structuralists, like Althusser, the structure is the theory. The meaning or function arises from the arrangement within the system itself.
And within this structuralist framework, there's this fascinating concept of the empty square. What's that about? Yes, this is a really interesting paradoxical object explored by structuralist and post-structuralist thinkers like Lacan and Levi-Strauss. The empty square, sometimes called the object X, is a paradoxical, eminently symbolic object within a structure. It doesn't belong neatly to any single series or category within the structure, but it's somehow present in and traverses both or all of them simultaneously. The examples often used are the letter in Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Purloined Letter, which gets its significance from circulating and changing hands between different parties, different symbolic positions.
Right. Its meaning changes depending on who has it and where it is.
Exactly. Or the debt in Freud's Ratman case, which takes on different meanings as it traverses various relationships and internal landscapes for the patient.
How does this empty square, this object that doesn't quite fit neatly anywhere, actually function within the structure? What does it do?
Well, this object acts as a kind of floating signifier or paradoxical element. It's a convergence point for divergent series within the structure. Its constant movement, its inability to settle into a fixed position, its very ubiquity and lack of fixed meaning is what produces sense within the structure. It's the dynamic element that makes the system signify, that keeps it from being static.
So it's the disruptive or mobile element that actually makes meaning possible by circulating.
In a sense, yeah, and this relates to the idea of nonsense. Nonsense in this structural context isn't just the absence of meaning. It's presented as an excess of sense, an overabundance or potential for meaning generated by the perpetual motion and a paradoxical nature of this object X animating the structure. Levi-Strauss discussed this with concepts like mana in some cultures, a word that acts as a kind of placeholder or thingamajig that can take on any meaning depending on its context, effectively producing meaning by filling a structural void. The techniques of writers like Husserl or Mallarmé also play with using abstract or arbitrary elements whose arrangement and movement create profound, sometimes unsettling sense. This two-sided empty square, like a word that is both a concrete object and a placeholder for meaning, or a problem that is both a specific issue and a generic template, is incredibly effective in creating sense within a system.
It's like the engine of meaning, but it's powered by something that doesn't quite make sense in itself. Fascinating. Let's shift gears slightly to power. Deleuze, drawing heavily on Foucault's work and his own collaboration with Guattari, has a pretty distinct understanding of how power operates, doesn't he?
Yes, absolutely. And they highlight the difficulty in understanding and locating power today. It's not simply held by the state or residing solely in specific apparatuses like the police or the government, although those are obviously key sites. While these are manifestations of power, power itself, they argue, is exercised everywhere. It's not held by one person or group in a centralized way, but functions through distributed relays, hierarchies, systems of control, surveillance networks, and is exercised by diverse groups in particular directions, often shaping behavior and thought in subtle, pervasive ways.
So it's more like a distributed network of forces, capillary action, than a top-down chain of command.
Much more like that. And a key insight they offer is that while it might be hard to pinpoint exactly who holds all the power, it's often very clear who doesn't have power, who is subject to its exercise.
That distinction feels important and rings true. You know who's on the receiving end.
It does. And because power is distributed and functions through relays, the struggle against power often happens around specific, localized focal points. This could be the boss in a workplace, the warden in a prison, the editor of a newspaper, the union representative, the psychiatrist. These are points where the network of power becomes visible and where resistance can coalesce. Denouncing these focal points, exposing how power functions through them, and crucially, breaking into the network of institutional information that power relies on to maintain its secrecy and control this, is a struggle against power. It turns the tables, forcing power into the open.
So the act of exposing information, of speaking truth to power, of making the invisible visible is a fundamental political struggle for them.
Precisely. They suggest the discourse of struggle is fundamentally opposed to the secret, not necessarily to the unconscious. It's about revealing, making visible, disrupting the flows of information that power hoards to maintain itself.
What are the broader political implications of their philosophy then, if power is everywhere and struggle is localized?
Well, their work has been highly influential in political theory that criticizes the very notion of the state not as a pre-given norm that we simply obey, but as a result of ongoing active creation and struggle. Politics, for thinkers influenced by Deleuze and Guattari, is often seen as living labor, as a continuous process of constituting social relations and power dynamics, often moving beyond the state form, as Hart and Negri might put it. It encourages a minoritarian approach to politics.
Minoritarian meaning not just numerical minorities.
Right, not just numerically smaller groups, but any position that resists being subsumed into dominant norms and insists on the right to self-creation and difference rather than assimilation. As thinkers like Paul Patton describe it, it's an active, process-oriented view of politics, always creating new lines of flight from dominant structures.
This ties back very clearly to the idea of creation and becoming, but applied directly to the social and political realm.
Yes, exactly. It's about seeing politics as a constant process of formation and resistance, not a fixed system. And they have a very specific, often critical take on capitalism's relationship with desire and power. Capitalism, they argue, is peculiar because it manages to be both completely public, everything is visible, the financial mechanisms, the transactions, yet utterly inadmissible, unacceptable on a deeper ethical level. Everything is legal, maybe, but nothing feels truly right or just. The organization of power within capitalism, how desiring flows invest the economic field is key, and they argue it actively fosters repression.
That's a striking idea that capitalism, despite its apparent transparency, thrives on a kind of fundamental repression of desire.
It's the idea that the intense, creative, disruptive flows of desire, the machinic potential of life, are immediately captured and rechanneled within capitalist systems in ways that prevent their truly transformative potential from being realized. They are made productive for capital, but at the cost of repressing their potential for other forms of becoming, other connections. This brings us back to revolutionary situations. These moments are often characterized by eruptions of desire or enthusiasm that aren't simply rational calculations but powerful collective effects. They are critical of political organizations, even revolutionary ones sometimes, that function as machines that refuse to truly liberate this revolutionary energy, instead capturing it and redirecting it back into existing structures or limited goals.
So there's a fundamental tension. How do you organize collective desire and action without immediately suppressing the very forces you are trying to unleash? How do you create new structures without falling back into the old patterns of repression? That sounds like a major dilemma.
That's one of the critical ongoing dilemmas their work highlights. Absolutely. Finding ways for collective desire to actualize invention rather than simply reproduce possibilities or fall back into established forms.
Let's shift gears again to a topic Deleuze wrote extensively on, cinema. He wrote 2 major books on film, which is unusual for a philosopher of his stature. What was he exploring there?
Yeah, it was a huge part of his work. And he wasn't just doing film criticism or history, although he analyzes countless specific films brilliantly. His project was deeply philosophical. How can sustained reflection on film illuminate fundamental philosophical questions about the nature of the image and its relation to thought?
So cinema as a way to do philosophy, not just analyze it.
Yes, in a way. He argues that what's most philosophically valuable in cinema is its power to turn viewers away from the thoughts they feel they own, from their fixed perspective as subjects. Cinema can traverse us with perceptions and images that are not ours, showing images in their impersonal power as simulacra, free from being tied to a single viewpoint or narrative function. Remember the simulacra.
Right, the appearances in themselves. Cinema can show us those.
Potentially, yes. And he sees a major shift in cinema history, right? He divides cinema into 2 major periods or types of image, the movement image and the time image.
Okay, movement image first. What's that?
The movement image characterizes classical cinema, roughly pre-WWII Hollywood, for example. It operates based on a sensory motor schema. You perceive something on screen, it leads directly to an action or reaction from a character, which leads to another perception, linked together by clear causality, often driven by thought and memory in a straightforward way. The focus is on actions, movement, and narrative propulsion.
It's cinema where things happen logically, characters react, and that drives the story forward. Action-reaction.
Exactly. It's the action-reaction cinema. Think classic westerns, gangster films, musicals even. But then, in post-WWII European art cinema, Italian neorealism, French New Wave, Antonioni, etc., he sees a profound shift to the time image. Here, the sensory motor links are broken or severely strained. Movement and action are no longer primary, they are subordinated to the flow of time itself. Characters often find themselves unable to act or react effectively. The causal chain is broken or irrelevant. They wander, they wait, they see things they can't respond to.
Examples you mentioned from the sources.
Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves is a classic example he uses for the time image. It's not an adventure film about recovering a stolen item through clever action. It's explicitly a film about the failure to act, about characters trapped in circumstances, about the passage of time and its effects on them when the sensory motor link is severed. The father sees the thief but can't catch him. The situation overwhelms action. Another key example is Michelangelo Antonioni's Avventura, famously an anti-drama, where a woman disappears, and the subsequent search leads not to a suspenseful resolution, but to aimless, wandering, ambiguous encounters, and a focus on the empty time between events.
So the drama is drained out, and time itself becomes the subject.
Precisely. As Deleuze puts it, quoting Hamlet, time is out of joint. In the time image, time itself is no longer just the container for movement. Movement is subordinated to time. Cinema, he argues, reflected and amplified this shift in the modern world, this crisis in action and belief.
Time takes center stage, becoming visible in itself rather than just a background clock for action.
Exactly, and the time image often employs what he calls irrational cuts. Unlike classical cinema, which uses editing, like shot reverse shot, to synthesize images into continuous wholes that serve narrative movement, the time image uses disjunctive, irrational cuts. These cuts break the experience down into singularities, into pure optical or sound situations, freeing the viewer from a single viewpoint or linear perspective. The image is no longer just perceived as an image of something specific within a narrative or tied to a character's point of view. It's the image in its singularity, presenting imaging as such before it's reincorporated into a viewpoint or a chronological sequence. It shows the production of movement and connection itself, rather than just representing it.
This feels very much connected back to the idea of simulacra in images without a fixed ground or origin, freeing the image.
Absolutely. The timed image allows cinema to approach the philosophical idea of the image as simulacrum, liberated from strict representation, narrative constraint, and anthropocentric perspective. It shows the power of images in themselves, the power of pure perception.
That's a unique way to appreciate film, thinking about the type of image it presents. Let's wrap up by talking about ethics. How do all these deep, complex philosophical ideas, difference, becoming, machines, the outside, translate into a way of living or understanding what constitutes a good life or a good action?
Well, ethics for Deleuze, drawing significantly from Spinoza, isn't about following a moral code or judging actions as good or bad based on external principles or laws. The core ethical relation is about affects about joy and sadness. Joy is any state or encounter, any combination of forces that increases your power to act, to affect and be affected, to live more fully, to connect more. Sadness is any state or encounter that diminishes that power, that constricts you, reduces your capacities, cuts you off.
So ethics is about maximizing vitality and connection and minimizing whatever decreases it, the kind of ethical physics of forces.
Yes, it's like a barometer of vitality and capacity. Ethical perception, then, in the sense of becoming imperceptible we discussed earlier, means learning to understand the impersonal forces that compose us and the world, how different combinations of these forces and the effects they produce either expand or contract our power. It's about moving beyond simple moral judgments, this person is good, bad, to understand the underlying dynamics of life itself, the forces at play in any encounter. This is the challenge of freedom in perception, learning to open ourselves to the life that passes through and composes us without immediately reducing it to a fixed identity or judging it within a preset system of good and evil. It's about assessing encounters based on whether they increase or decrease our capacity to be, our joy.
And Spinoza's philosophy provides the framework for this affirmative ethics.
Deleuze sees Spinoza's work as incredibly interactive and even calls it a unique non-philosophy because it moves philosophy beyond mere representation to actual interaction and action. Spinoza, for Deleuze, shows us that we are in the middle of Spinoza, which means we are already in the middle of everything, part of a vast interconnected system of motion and speed, relation. Existence is a process of interacting forces. A bird flying is a certain relationship of motion and speed. A mountain carving is another. Our emotions aren't just internal states. They are effects, effects of being interacted with by the world and interacting back. They are transitions in our power, increases or decreases.
Effects of interaction, constantly changing our state of power, our capacity.
Exactly. Spinoza helps us understand, act, and be in the world by focusing on these dynamics of connection and composition, rather than getting stuck in moralizing or rigid categories. It aligns with what they see as the true potential essence of being human, which is often obscured by language and ideology that makes us feel like separate, static, isolated entities cut off from the flows and connections of life. Spinoza, for Deleuze, offers a path to understand ourselves as dynamic parts of this larger, interconnected, constantly changing process of existence.
It's an ethics focused on dynamism and connection, not static rules. What about Nietzsche's influence on his ethics? He's another key figure.
Nietzsche is absolutely crucial, particularly his distinction between active and reactive forces. Reactive forces are those that don't act directly, but react against other forces. They are often tied to what Nietzsche called a will to nothingness, resentment, ressentiment, and lead to states like bad conscience and the creation of concepts like sin to condemn the active forces they resent and envy. Active forces, on the other hand, command, create, affirm, and express their power directly without needing to oppose something else first. They act from abundance.
And how do you move from the reactive state, which sounds unfortunately quite common, to the active? How do you overcome that resentment?
Conquering nihilism, which for Nietzsche is the prevalence of reactive forces and the will to nothingness, involves a transmutation of the reactive or passive forces into active ones. It's about regaining the rights of activity and the health of force. But Deleuze, following Nietzsche, notes this doesn't happen by simply stepping outside of nihilism as if it were a different country. It happens within the kingdom of nihilism itself. Nihilism is defeated, in a sense, by itself as reactive forces shift their alliances and potential, becoming capable of affirming and creating instead of just reacting and resenting. It's an internal transformation.
So it's not about destroying the reactive force, but transforming them.
Exactly. Nietzsche's critique in this reading isn't against some accidental human flaw, but against what he saw as man's very essence in his current reactive form, the skin disease of the earth, as he put it. But he also evokes the possibility of masters or free individuals, suggesting that the reactive man has only deformed this inherent potential for activity that exists within force itself. The goal is to unleash that potential.
It's a complex internal transformation, not a simple overthrowing. Wow. Okay. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground, from the fundamental challenge to the image of thought and the primacy of identity, through concepts like simulacra, transcendental repetition, the dynamics of becoming, his understanding of machines and desiring flows, the radical distinction between the exterior and the outside, his take on power as a distributed network, his philosophy of cinema, and his action-oriented ethics rooted in vitality and active force. It's dense material. How does Deleuze himself suggest engaging with work this complex? Did he offer any advice?
He famously described theory as a toolbox. His philosophy isn't meant to be a totalizing system that explains everything or provides a final answer. It's a set of tools. It has to be used. It has to work. If a concept or theory doesn't function, if nobody can use it to think differently or engage with reality in a new way, then it's worthless or its time hasn't come yet. Theory doesn't aim to totalize. It aims to multiply possibilities, connections, and lines of flight. And importantly, theory, for Deleuze, is inherently opposed to power structures, which always tend towards totalization and control. As soon as theoretical tools take hold at a specific point, a point of resistance, a point of questioning, they create the potential for an explosion, a disruption of existing power relations.
A toolbox for disruption and creation. That's a great way to frame it. Practical tools, not just abstract ideas. For someone new to Deleuze, maybe feeling a bit intimidated by the complexity and the terminology, where would you suggest they start reading, based on the sources we looked at?
The sources offer some practical guidance, yeah. For those interested in literature, Proust in Signs is often mentioned as an excellent starting point because it introduces many of his key philosophical themes like time, the virtual, signs, and becoming through the lens of literature, which can make them more accessible initially. His collected essays on literature, essays, critical and clinical, and his collaborative book with Guattari on Kafka, Towards a Minor Literature, are also recommended entry points if literature is your primary interest.
What about his more purely philosophical texts? Where to dip a toe in there?
His earlier works, particularly those on other philosophers like empiricism and subjectivity on Hume, or his books on Nietzsche or Bergson, are often described as relatively clearer and less reliant on his fully developed, sometimes more idiosyncratic terminology. They show his foundational ideas taking shape. For his major works, Difference and Repetition, and the collaborations with Guattari, Anti-Oedipus, and A Thousand Plateaus, these are huge encyclopedic books and can be overwhelming to read cover to cover initially.
Yeah, A Thousand Plateaus especially looks daunting.
It does. The strong suggestion from the sources, and it's good advice, I think, is not to feel you have to master the whole thing at once. Instead, pick a single chapter or a plateau from 1,000 plateaus that resonates with you, for instance, the chapter on the image of thought in Difference and Repetition, or the introduction to schizoanalysis in Anti-Oedipus, or the plateau on becoming woman or becoming animal in 1,000 plateaus. These sections can give you a real feel for his concepts and style without requiring you to grasp the entire complex architecture of the book right away.
So treat these major books like a landscape you can enter at different points, rather than a linear path you must follow from beginning to end. Find a spot that sparks your interest and explore from there.
Exactly. Wander around in them. And remember the core impulse behind it all. Philosophy, for Deleuze, is ultimately about looking for vitality, whether that's philosophical vitality in concepts, political vitality in social movements, or psychological vitality in desire and effect. It's about learning to see the decisive repetitions and changes, the forces and processes that compose reality beneath the surface of fixed forms and identities.
And thinking about that idea, mentioned in one of the sources, of uncommon humans on deserted islands, these absolute creators, pure artists, prototypes of a potential humanity. It's quite a striking image.
It is provocative, isn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests a potential for humanity that is radically free from conventional norms, pure in its creative capacity, perhaps only possible in isolation, or perhaps requiring a collective imagination to bring into being. Connecting with this idea of a potential humanity, this prototype, is part of the task, maybe. what could we become?
It definitely challenges us to think about what human being could be beyond what we currently experience or assume.
A powerful thought to hold on to, yeah.
So, to recap this deep dive, we've explored how Deleuze fundamentally challenges traditional thought based on identity, urging a philosophy centered on process, difference, and becoming as primary. We've unpacked concepts like simulacra as the very stuff of the world, transcendental repetition as a force for difference, the dynamics of becoming imperceptible, animal, sexual, as ways to engage with the flows of life, and his unique understanding of machines and desiring flows as the fundamental components of reality.
And we touched on the distinction between the conventional exterior and the radical outside as the plane of immanence, his view of power as a pervasive, distributed network, his philosophy of cinema's epical shift from the movement image to the time image, and his practical, action-oriented ethics, drawing on Spinoza's vitality and Nietzsche's active forces.
His work consistently pushes us to see process, connection, and difference as the fundamental reality, rather than fixed identities, stable forms, or predetermined meanings. It encourages us to look for the forces, flows, and becomings that compose life, thought, and society, often hidden beneath the surface of convention and common sense.
It definitely gives you a different lens through which to view the world and maybe yourself.
It certainly does. And here's a thought to leave you with, something to ponder maybe. If all life is machinic and defined by its connections and processes, and if truly creative thinking requires opening to the radical outside and becoming imperceptible to our usual systems of judgment, what unexpected connections or surprising becomings are already happening in your own life, just below the surface of your perception, waiting to be affirmed or perhaps transformed? What forces are shaping your reality right now that you haven't yet fully seen or understood?
Something to mull over as you navigate your day. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the often complex but always stimulating world of Gilles Deleuze.
We hope this helps you start navigating that challenging but rewarding philosophical ocean. Until next time.